Hello, how are you? And welcome to another Ruby Doo art class. Today we are going to be making a coloured pencil and watercolour pencil drawing of a beautiful Mediterranean lemon tree or orange garland. So for this project you're going to need some watercolour pencils or normal pencils if you prefer. Some watercolour or heavyweight paper, a pencil and a rubber, preferably a soft mouldable eraser or putty rubber to help you to get those lines erased before we start adding colour. So along with this video you should have been sent a PDF of images and a few instructions I'm going to refer to during the video. So make sure you've had a look at those. Also make sure you watch the whole video through first of all so you can get an idea of the processes, and then you can come right back to the beginning and you can draw along with me, pausing the video whenever you think you need to. Okay, so let's make a start. So this is page 1 of your PDF, and on it, obviously you can have a read through it yourself, but on it I talk about the choice of composition for your page. So there's 5 little doodles there. They are basically my little illustrations of how you could position your drawing on the page, and how just cropping an image slightly can change the look of it, can change the feel of it. So the first one, for example, is just your lemon tree in a pot, just sitting in the middle of the paper, quite a standard sort of composition. But you can see in the second one, we've cropped it more so that the pot and the plant are filling more of the frame. So less of the background is showing through, and even though it's essentially the same image, it just has a different feel to it. The third one, I've cropped the frame so that it's more of a tall, narrow ratio of border, and I've moved the object over to the side, so you're only seeing half of it. Now, you don't even have to go for a square or a rectangle. You could create your drawing inside a circle, or you could pop it landscape. And on number 5 there, the 5th little drawing that I've done, I've just done a branch with leaves and lemons on it, but with a shadow underneath it, so it looks like it's laid on a table or a surface of some sort like that. So it was just really to get you thinking about different ways that you can arrange your picture. Now there are also some images on your PDF that you can look at for inspiration, or you could use some images of your own. So in a moment you'll see that I have started to draw the frame for my example, and I decided to do a tall, narrow border. So on my A3 piece of watercolour paper, I've taken a ruler and I've just drawn, I've measured across the top just so that I can make sure it's nice and even and it's not going to be too skew with. But I've just drawn a tall, narrow rectangle, and I'm going to go for the third option on those little drawings that I did on the previous slide, which is the quite close crop drawing but slightly off to the side, so I'm only actually seeing part of the tree and the pot, only part of the pot on the right hand side. So I started off by drawing a semicircle where I wanted the main body of the bushy part of the tree to be, and then I started by drawing in some circles for where I wanted the oranges to be. So this is going to be an orange tree rather than a lemon tree. Drew those circles in really lightly, and then just started to fill in some leaf shapes around those oranges, but also slightly overlapping some of the oranges too. Quite rough shapes. So not too detailed at this point, but what I was trying to do is making sure that they are roughly the same size as each other obviously slightly differing because they're not going to be absolutely perfect, and some wide and some narrow, so that they look like they're sitting at different angles. So obviously a broad leaf will look like it's facing towards us, like we can see the whole face of the leaf, but a more narrow leaf would look like it's slightly angled away from us as the viewer, and that again just helps to give that 3D effect. And I've just drawn a couple of extra leaves, just poking down from the bottom of that circle, just to sort of give it a little bit of unevenness, and just breaking out that circle a little bit so it looks a little less artificial, and a bit less manicured. It looks a little bit more natural, hopefully. The pot at the bottom there, you can see it's going off the edge of the rectangle. I'm just making sure that my ellipse is nice and smooth, so that it's looking nice for when I start to paint it. And then what I'm doing here with my kneadable eraser, putty rubber, is going over and rubbing out any of my guidelines, any of my little sketchy bits of drawing that I did 2 or 3 times to improve them, but also lightening up some of my pencil marks, because I don't want these to show through on my painting. Now, I always say on these videos and in my classes, your pencil marks should be as light as possible, so really, really faint, so that you can just about see them. I always do them a little bit darker than that, so that you can see them on the camera, but yeah, as light as possible with your pencil marks would be absolutely fab. In terms of what pencil to use, an HB or a 2B pencil would be perfect for this sort of thing, because it's soft enough that you can just get some gentle marks on there. So straight in with some colour, and you can see here, and I'm going to do a second one in a moment, so if you don't catch exactly what I'm doing on this first one, you'll see what I'm doing on the second one. These are oranges, but I'm not going straight in there with the orange pencil. These are watercolour pencils that I'm using, so I'm going to be applying water afterwards. All I'm doing here is laying down the pigment, which I'm then going to wet with a wet brush. So we'll hop back over to my class recording now, and you'll hear me explain what I'm doing. Just a few things to think about is that, especially if you're going to be using any water anywhere near your drawing, your lines need to be as pale as possible, because that grey pencil, as soon as you start to apply water anywhere near it, it will mix in with the colour and it will go a bit muddy. So you want to try and lighten that pencil as much as possible. I've kept mine dark. Again, I know that that's going to have some risks, but I've done that so that you can see my lines. If I was to make that as pale as it should be, you wouldn't be able to see it. So you can use watercolour pencils today, or normal pencils, whatever you feel most comfortable with. I'm just going to demonstrate a couple of different ideas with watercolour pencil. I just wanted to talk about colour, because you can mix the watercolour pencils just like you would mix paint. And I encourage you to do that, rather than just using the colours as they are in the pencil. So for example, these are going to be oranges. If I just take that orange pencil, that's the colour that I get. It's a really bright neon, slightly fake orange. So instead, what I've done here is I've first of all done a layer of yellow. So all across the orange, I've actually done a layer of yellow first. Because what I'm doing is I'm thinking ahead to how these are going to mix and blend when I put some water on there. So I'm putting a little bit of yellow pigment down. And then I took the orange, but then what I did was just where I want the orange to start to look a little bit darker. So look on your source image, where are the shadows? That's when I start to then put a little bit of that orange in, because that's going to mix with that yellow and just make a much more subtle orange shade. And in the very lightest areas, I might even just leave it yellow, because that just gives a nice highlight. Now, I'm not worrying at the moment about things like dimples or texture or anything like that, because the textured paper will give us a little bit of that. But also, we can go back in and put fine detail in once the watercolour pencil has dried. When we've applied the water, let it dry, we can then go back in and use these as normal pencils and just start to add that detail in afterwards. You'll see that those two, if you can see them, they're a little bit different. This one has got a little bit more shadow in it than that one, and that is because the final thing I did was go in with a little bit of brown. So a little bit of brown into that orange at the bottom just gives it a little bit more of a naturalistic sort of shadow. Now you could leave it like that if you wanted to. You could leave it just as like a pencil drawing, because these can be just used as normal pencils and they blend together really nicely. Or you could have a little experiment with some water. Now I would definitely recommend that you do a little practice at the side, because depending on what paper you're using or how much pencil you've put on the paper, it will act slightly differently. So we don't want to put water on here and then be surprised at what it does. So you might want to just have a little practice, because some of the colours, when you add water to them, go a little bit darker or a little bit lighter, or some of them change hue very, very slightly. So have a little practice at the side first. And then I'm going to go in with some water and I'm just going to add a little bit just round here. Now, one thing to be wary of as well when you're using this is when you're adding water to that pencil that you've shaded in, that colour is going onto your brush as well. So if I took my brush now and started to wet the top, I might end up getting all that dark orange and brown into the top part of there. So you've got to remember to keep cleaning your brush if you're moving from a dark area to a light area. So you can see actually how that colour has become more vivid when I've wet it. So it's a good thing to just try it out. So I'm going to clean it off so that I can come to this lighter area, and all I'm doing is just wetting that lovely yellow. I'm not contaminating it with any of the orange or the brown from the bottom of the orange, and I might just leave the centre of it unpainted or unwetted, if that's a word, because it's showing a little bit of the white paper through, and I quite like that. It's giving it like a little bit of almost like a little sheen to the surface of the orange. So yeah, just be aware that as you're wetting that paper and wetting the pencil, that colour is getting loaded up on your brush. If I went over here now, see it's picked it all up. So if I'm going to a lighter area now, I just need to make sure I wash that off, and then look, it just stays nice and yellow. See, it's picked the yellow up as well. And sometimes that's a nice thing, because you've got a brush that's nicely loaded up with paint now, and you might want to just go and fill in some other areas or play around with that colour, add it somewhere else. But yeah, just be aware of that. Now I'm going to let those oranges dry, and then I'm going to go back in with some of these, or maybe even some reds, just to start putting some dimply patterns and things like that in there as well. Now when you come to doing leaves, really do think about the whole range of greens and browns that you've got in your set, and really try and use that theory that we've just used on those oranges with these as well. So not every leaf needs to be just one shade of green. Let's have a look at this one here. So it might be that I use this green at the bottom, and the great thing about these pencils is as well, you can sort of be a bit scribbly with them, because as soon as you put the water on, that's going to even all of that out. Yeah, sorry, I'm just checking I'd actually picked up watercolour pencils and not normal pencils. That evens all of that out. So all you're doing when you're drawing onto the page is really applying the pigment ready for the water to come along and pick it up and mix it around. So I'm being a little bit scribbly on this one. I'm going to add a little bit of brown to the bottom because when I add the water to that, that's going to make the bottom part of that leaf look a little bit darker. It'll give it a nice 3D effect. So let's get a little bit of this olive green in, like that. So it looks a little bit random at the moment, but using all those different greens will have a nice effect on it when you put the water on. Now I'm just got to remember to clean this brush off because I don't want all this lovely dark green to go in the top. So just give that a wash. And then I'll get all those nice olives and lighter greens coming through in the top there. And it works just like watercolour now, so you could, if you needed to, you could lift out, you could, like I am here, I'm just lifting a little bit out to give it a little lighter highlight up there. But yeah, think of it like your first layer of colour, and then once that's dry you can always do more over the top as well. So that to me is looking a little bit too like it's, I don't like that perfect line across the middle. I'm just going to put a little bit of this in. Now you can go over it with your pencil whilst it's still wet, but just be aware that it will go a little bit fuzzy. But yeah, have a little experiment in the spaces that you've got at the side to see what you can and can't do with these watercolour pencils. So there you have it. The really great thing about a project like this is when you've got lots and lots of leaves to do, you can really have fun with the colours. So I've picked out all of the greens that I've got in my box, and in different parts of the leaves I've put in different little scribbles of colour. So mainly sort of darker greens on the underside of the leaves, lighter greens towards the top, but I'm trying to mix it up on each of them so they don't all look like carbon copies of each other. And then a little bit of water on my brush just to start to blend those colours together. But again, I'm not that bothered about putting water all over the leaf. Some areas I'm leaving the pencil marks showing. I think it just adds a little bit more texture and interest. And also bear in mind that you can go back over these afterwards, so you don't have to be too precious about each one. You know, just consider this like the base layer, the base coat, and then you can always add more if you need it later on. So now you can see that I'm attempting the, am I going to say trunk of the tree when it's in a pot? Is it more like a stem? Either way, I've picked up all of the different browns that I've got. So, I mean, you might be restricted by what colours you've got in your watercolour pencil tin, but I've got a couple of browns, but I've also put a little bit of olive green in there too, so that when I go over it with the brush, those colours all sort of mingle together. And if you could see, I was just drawing the lines in quite a wiggly, textural, like a knotted sort of tree bark texture. And you can definitely see that a little bit better now that it's got this close-up. Now look at the soil. I'm using a dark brown. I'm using the pencil on its side, so I'm sort of scumbling with the pencil, you know, when you rub it across the paper on its side, not using the very, very point. And I'm also just scumbling in a little bit of black watercolour pencil as well. Very scribbly, very textured, so that when I go over that with the water, it doesn't make for a really, really smooth texture. It makes a nice sort of soil-like texture. And again, I'm leaving some parts of it dry, so that you can still see the pencil marks, and I'm just using the brush to neaten up that ellipse there at the front. When that's dry, I can always go back into that, maybe with some white pencil, to add a few little textural highlights. Now these next few leaves that you see me draw, you'll notice they're a little bit different because I am using much, much darker colours with them. So I'm going straight in there with the brown, the darkest brown that I've got. You could use a very light layering of black if you want to as well. Only a little bit though, because obviously too much black and it's just going to stick out like a sore thumb. But I'm doing 3 at the same time of these leaves. You can see that I've gone in with the dark brown, then I'm going in there with a green, and that green and that dark brown are going to mingle really nicely when we put the water on. Now the reason that I'm doing them much darker is, if you look at those leaves, they are sitting behind some of the leaves. They're poking out from behind some of the leaves that are more in the foreground that we've already done. And can you see how it's created a really nice shadow? That is really going to give our tree depth. So consider that when you're painting in leaves that are behind other leaves, that you need to create that illusion of depth by putting in some darker tones. Now, something a little bit different happening here. Look at all these gaps in between these leaves. So what are we going to do with those gaps? Well, we want to make them look dark and shadowy. So I am using a little bit of dark brown, a little bit of black, a little bit of green, and just starting to blend those in with the brush. And I might even, you know, you've got to sort of judge it as you go, but I might even start to put a bit of pencil in there whilst it's wet, just to make it look patchy. You want it to look not necessarily a smooth, flat colour. You want it to look like it's very, very shadowy, like there's branches in there, there's leaves in there, but it's really dark. You can't really tell, but it just looks like random patches and blocks of dark, dark colour. And that will help, again, to make the leaves that you've already done pop forward. So those little gaps in between, we're creating illusion of depth and shadow to make this tree start to pop and look 3D. And it's amazing actually when you look quickly at the before and after of how different the shadows just make the whole thing look. So yeah, let's see how this develops. So you see it's worked with these dark areas in now. Just in this last sort of minute you've seen the real difference with it going from something with gaps in it to something that's really starting to look 3D. So I'm just using the orange and the brown now just to try and get this sort of dimply effect into the oranges. Now because it is quite small and close up you might not be able to see sort of where you are, but you're welcome to come up and have a closer look in a minute. But what I'm doing is with the brown and orange, I'm just starting to do almost like tiny little spiral, circle, curly-whirly shapes just around the bottom of the orange, first of all, because that just then starts to give it a sense of it's not completely smooth, it has some texture and dimples in it. But then as I get towards the centre of the orange, I'm just letting those fade out. And then when I get to the top, I'm going to start to put a few more in. And these are going to just be tiny, tiny little circles that I'm drawing with the orange pencil. Some of them are complete circles, some of them are more just like semicircles, but just random, a few little dots here and there as well, so that from a distance, because that's what you want to create an effect from a distance, it's just starting to make it look a little bit more dimpled, a bit more textured, because the watercolour pencil, when you go over it with the water, it can smooth it out. So we need to bring some of that texture back out again. You can do the same with the leaves as well. If your leaves are starting to look, I mean, the leaves on these plants are quite sort of smooth and waxy anyway, but you might need to just add in a little bit more shadow here and there, especially where you've got leaves that are overlapping. It really helps to bring this sense of 3D if you add some darker tones where you see one leaf coming out from behind another leaf. So say here, this leaf is in front of this leaf, so on this one I'm just going to add a little bit more dark green just where there might be a shadow being cast, just to start to help bring some things forward and send some things back. And it was like I was just saying previously about the gaps in between the leaves. In between them I've just used dark greens, browns, a little bit of black here and there, just to make a patchy, random sense of shadow. So we know that there are leaves behind these leaves in the forefront, but we can't really see them. We can see just hints of dark green, dark brown, black, just to give it a sense of depth. So these pencils and the normal pencils can be used now on top of the dried watercolour to start to give a little bit more texture. Background can stay white if you want it to, or you can experiment with a little bit of colour. I would definitely, if you're doing a background, I would definitely practice that on the side, just so that you can judge if you want a subtle shade. So let's say, for example, we wanted a subtle shade of blue, I don't know, just so you can experiment with how much paper needs to go on there. Sorry, not paper, how much pencil needs to go on there to create the tone that you want. So here I've just done 3 very different tones of that blue, and when I wet them, you'll see the difference. So it does go slightly darker when you wet it. Sometimes it goes lighter as it dries, sometimes it doesn't, depends on what colour you're using. But you can see those differences there just by the amount of pencil I've laid onto the paper. It's giving me a much different range of tones. So think about that carefully if you are doing a background. If you are doing a background as well, I would suggest using a thicker brush than this one when you add the water to it. Otherwise it can end up looking patchy because you're doing small bits at a time and it will end up looking patchy. You want a nice thick brush so you can do a nice quick wash of colour all in one go. So before I do a background, let's do a little bit of this pot. I deliberated for ages what colour to do this pot. I thought about doing it terracotta, I thought about doing it a bright colour, and then in the end I couldn't decide, so I went for a grey because actually I thought that might just help the colour of the oranges and the leaves to pop a little bit more. I didn't want to do anything that's going to distract from them. So yeah, it's a grey pot, but again I'm thinking about where the shadows are going to be underneath that little lip of the top rim, down the sides, and just making sure that colour is a little bit stronger in those areas. So yes, I'm now going to put a background in. So you can see I'm holding the pencil on its side so that I'm getting much more of a, more of like I'm rubbing the pencil on the paper rather than sketching with it. And I'm doing a really loose, very, very light, all over scribble. Because I know that once I put the water on, it will blend in together nicely because I've done a little practice on the side. So I know how this particular pencil behaves when I put water on it. That's why it's really important for you to do a practice with yours so that you know how yours behaves, so that you know how much or how little to put on. So yeah, you'll see me doing the background, and then this is going to be pretty much done apart from any few little last minute tweaks I might want to do. And I'm really pleased with that background because it is very pale, very subtle, a little bit patchy, which I like because it just makes it look a little bit more natural. So that is pretty much done for this project. I really hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful, and I really hope that you've had a go yourself. So please send me a photo of how yours comes out, and I will see you soon. Thanks for watching.